There is a stretch of water, just 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, sitting between Iran and Oman. It doesn't look like much on a map. But right now, that tiny strip of ocean is the single most important piece of geography on the planet for the global economy. Every single day, around 20 million barrels of oil pass through it. That's roughly 20% of the entire world's oil consumption. Moving through a corridor so narrow that large tankers have to use designated lanes just a few miles wide. Add to that nearly 20% of the world's entire liquefied natural gas supply, and you begin to understand what we're dealing with. This is the Strait of Hormuz, and right now it is either closed or on the edge of closure. So today on Yacht Economy, we're breaking down exactly what happens to the world's economy when this choke point shuts down. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers here are staggering. According to researchers, roughly $1.2 trillion in annual trade flows through or out of the 5 Gulf nations directly dependent on the strait, including the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Iran. Of that, nearly $800 billion is pure energy, crude oil, LNG, and refined petroleum products. But here's where it gets serious. When economists calculate the full downstream damage of a prolonged closure, the number doesn't stop at $1.2 trillion. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas has modeled the scenario, and their findings are stark. A full closure removes close to 20% of global oil supplies from the market almost immediately. Oil prices spike, supply chains fracture, and global GDP growth gets slashed by an annualized 2.9 percentage points in a single quarter. Over a 12-month period, the total economic damage to the global economy could reach $2.50 to $3 trillion in lost GDP. That is the $3 trillion choke point, and that's the conservative estimate. Now, let's talk about oil prices, because that's where every American feels it first. When the strait tightens, Brent crude doesn't wait. We've already seen it jump 10 to 13% within days of a crisis escalating. JP Morgan has warned that a full military conflict resulting in Hormuz closure could push prices to $120 to $130 per barrel. Some analysts say $150 is not off the table in an extended disruption. For every $10 increase in oil prices, global GDP growth shrinks by 0.2 to 0.3 percentage points. Now, do the math on a $70 per barrel increase. We're talking about a potential reduction of 1.4 to 2.1 percentage points in global growth. From a baseline of around 3%, pushing the world dangerously close to, or straight into, a global recession, economists put the probability of a global recession at 70 to 85% if the closure extends beyond 60 days. You fill up your car, and the price at the pump climbs. Airlines raise ticket prices because jet fuel costs more. Manufacturers pay more to move their goods. Grocery stores raise prices because food shipments cost more to transport. It cascades fast. But here's what most people miss. This isn't just an oil story. Qatar, the world's second largest exporter of LNG, sends 93% of its gas shipments through the Strait of Hormuz. There is no meaningful alternative route, none. If Hormuz closes, Europe, which was already sitting at just 30% gas storage capacity heading into 2026, faces a full-blown energy crisis. Dutch TTF gas benchmarks have already surged past 60 euros per megawatt. Heating bills spike, industrial production slows, economies stall. Then there's the fertilizer problem. Gulf nations account for roughly 45% of the world's sulfur supply and are major producers of urea, a key ingredient in fertilizers. A Hormuz shutdown doesn't just hit your gas tank, it hits global food production. The UN World Food Programme has already flagged this as a serious concern. Food costs rise, and the people who can least afford it. The 3.4 billion people already spending more on debt than on healthcare and education, they absorb the worst of it. Even helium, critical for semiconductor manufacturing, gets disrupted. That means your next smartphone, your laptop, your electric vehicle, all face production delays. Now, let's talk about who gets hit hardest. Asia is the most exposed region on Earth to a Hormuz closure. China receives roughly 37% of all crude oil and condensate flowing through the strait. India takes 14.7%, South Korea 12%, Japan 10.9%. Together, China and India alone receive more than half of all Hormuz oil flows. Japan is particularly vulnerable. It depends on imported fossil fuels for 87% of its total energy, and 95% of its crude oil comes from the Middle East. A sustained closure would hammer the yen, blow out its trade deficit, and push Japan towards stagflation. South Korea holds around 200 days of strategic petroleum reserves, which buys time. But at 1.7 million barrels per day flowing through Hormuz, the clock ticks fast. China is in a contradictory position. It's the world's largest oil importer. It buys over 90% of Iran's oil exports, so it has a direct financial interest in keeping Iran economically viable and, simultaneously, a massive incentive to keep the strait open. And what about the United States? The US is far less directly exposed than Asia. Only about 2.5% of Hormuz crude flows to America. Thanks to the shale revolution, making the US largely energy self-sufficient, but that does not mean America is immune. Global oil is priced globally. Even if you don't import a single barrel from the Gulf, if Brent crude hits $130, your gas prices go up. Your supply chains get more expensive. Inflation, which the Fed has been fighting for years, comes roaring back. The 30-year mortgage rate has already climbed to 6.38% in March 2026, partly as a reaction to this very crisis. The 10-year bond yield hit 4.46%, its highest level since mid-2025. The Stimson Center put it plainly, a sustained Hormuz disruption raises fuel and freight costs, worsens inflation expectations, tightens financial conditions, and hits hardest the import-dependent emerging markets. But developed economies, including the United States, do not escape the shockwave. So what are the alternatives? Can the world route around Hormuz? There are two partial bypass options. Saudi Arabia has a pipeline to the Red Sea with a capacity of around 5 million barrels per day. The UAE has a pipeline to the port of Fujairah, handling roughly 1.5 million barrels per day. Together, that's maybe 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day in alternative capacity. But remember, 20 million barrels per day move through Hormuz. The alternative routes cover less than 30% of that volume. There is no bypass for LNG. Qatar has no pipeline alternative. The gap is simply too large. UNTAD projects that global merchandise trade growth will slow from 4.7% in 2025 to just 1.5 to 2.5% in 2026. If the disruption persists, global economic growth is expected to fall from 2.9% in 2025 to 2.6% in 2026. And that is under the assumption that the conflict does not intensify further. This is why the Strait of Hormuz has been called the most important 33 kilometers of water on the planet. It is not just an oil route, it is the artery through which the modern global economy breathes. Energy, gas, fertilizers, metals, petrochemicals, roughly 900 vessels transited it every single week before this crisis. That number collapsed to just 6 daily transits in March 2026, down 95% from normal levels. The International Energy Agency's head described the current situation as, and I quote, the greatest global energy security challenge in history. That is not hyperbole. That is the assessment of the world's leading energy watchdog. The $3 trillion number is not a fear-mongering headline. It is what the models show. It is what the data says. When a 33-kilometer strait can determine whether families in Tokyo, London, New Delhi, and Chicago can afford to heat their homes or fill their tanks, that is a choke point. And right now, the world is staring directly at the consequences of what happens when it closes.